Purpose of this video is to kind of give you a background information on luxury watches, right? Watches in general. So I was out on YouTube looking around for something. I was actually typed in the keyword luxury watch intro. I didn't see anything, so here I go. This video is going to be different than anything else that's out there for the main reason is, number one, I'm going to assume you know nothing about watches at all, but I'm also going to give you more of a historical background about the technology at the time, essentially how the market came to being. This is just my own opinion. So with that being said, I'm not a watch expert. I don't work at a jewelry store. I'm just a regular guy. You know, my other videos are about blowing leaves and stuff like that. But I think if you're going to buy something, it's important to do your research on it. It just so happens that I'm interested in watches. I'm going to start off talking about maybe when all these watches started, you know, the luxury watch movement, Rolex, so forth and so on. I'm going to start off talking about the technology that was available in like the 50s, maybe how some of the hobbies people were into, how they needed these type of things. I'm going to go into why people might have developed a need for a watch, and then I'm going to finish it off with like watch terminology. So this is so in case you go into a store, you probably at least be able to have an intelligent conversation with the salesperson and not get jerked. So that's the summary. I'm going to get right back into it. Let's start off with, I guess, technology, just to kind of set the scene there. So, I mean, if you can, let's imagine yourself in the 50s, right? We're in the 50s. Not a lot of technology there. So let's say 1950 to 1960, you know, as far as clocks were concerned, things weren't like how they are now, obviously, right? There wasn't, you know, a clock that's on your phone or just in general. People had these huge house clocks, a wall clock. They also had watches that they wore, but just there was not a lot of really, not a lot of technology available for you to keep time. As you can imagine, it's very important to be able to know, you know, what time it is when you're going somewhere. So, for example, around that time, Timex had a decent wristwatch that was out. It was around $85 in today's time. You know, you're thinking, wow, $85 is a lot of money. I don't think I'd ever pay that for a cheap Timex watch. But you got to remember, I mean, there weren't that many other alternatives. You either had a huge wall clock, maybe at the town square, kind of like in Back to the Future, the town clock. Again, there just weren't that many things available, so the prices were higher. Or if you had a clock in your house, there were these huge wall clocks you could buy, and they were around $220 in today's dollars, which sounds outrageous. You're thinking to yourself, first of all, I would never pay $85 for a watch, and then I would definitely not pay $220 for a wall clock. But again, think about it. The clocks at these times, this was before quartz, right? These were all mechanical movements, cogs, gears, things like that. These were all made by hand. So anytime you have something made by hand, it's going to cost more. You just know that. And again, I'm still just trying to set it in scene here, give you the type of technology that's available there. So you might have had a wristwatch, or you might have had this huge wall clock. As far as like audio, they first came out with clock radios in the 50s. Things you could probably put on your bedside or in your living room. Integrated clock radio. And research I have shows that when the first one came out, it was available for around $480 in today's dollars. I know, you're thinking, wow, this is crazy, but that's what it was there. Just to give you a comparison, the leading cutting edge technology in the 50s, 1955, let's say, was a 24-inch console television, which in today's dollars, you could buy that for around $2,200. Which, that's another one where I did the research. I was thinking to myself, $2,000 for a 24-inch television console? But I mean, if you had that, you were really doing it. Because around that time, most people didn't even have a television to begin with. They just had a radio maybe, or you may have had a hi-fi. And again, I mean, this is all relative, right? You would say, well, there's no way I'd pay that kind of money for anything. But I mean, look at today. It's 2016. There's people who will pay $5,000 for a 4K TV, right? And they'd say, well, yeah, it's a TV. Technology becomes available. You're always going to have people who are willing to pay that extra price for it. So again, I'm just setting the scene here about the technology that was available there. As far as now, let's bring it back into watches, right? So Timex wristwatch you buy for like 85 bucks. A lot of money at the time, but you needed a watch. You needed to know how to tell time. Considering that there was a lot of technology, there wasn't that much technology available. People had different hobbies. At that time, maybe in the 50s, early 60s, probably the working population were ex World War II veterans, right? Guys came back from the war in the mid 40s. Now it's like 10 years later. They're in their 30s, let's just say in general. They're used to a life of adventure, right? And there's not a lot of entertainment at home. People would probably read a lot, go to cocktail parties. So they tend to do more outside activities. So now I'm going to transition into clocks, and then I'm going to tell you how that, in my opinion, I think ties into outdoor activities. In the 50s, or this 50s, one of the big things that happened is that National Geographic put out an article about Jacques Cousteau's underwater archaeology near Marseille. And this was like a really big deal because it was exciting, it was adventurous, it was a new frontier. So think about that. You have a guy who's used to going on adventure, in war. It was just a fad. It kind of swept the whole nation. Everybody got into scuba diving. People were into scuba diving, right? People started. There wasn't all this type of scuba gear and none of this stuff. This was pretty much like the invention of it. So one of the big hobbies that people got into around that time was scuba diving. Also, motorsports. Um, Around that time frame, you first had the Corvette that came out. I mean, beautiful. You also had the Mustang that came out a couple years after that. So you have a situation where there's not a lot of technology available. People are doing more outdoor activities. They're not just sitting around and watching TV, obviously. They're into car racing, maybe racing their Mustang, scuba diving, getting into it. You're going to want to have a watch that you can use for that. Now, of course, for racing, I'm thinking they were probably using stopwatches, right? Like you see in some of the old movies. But, that probably wasn't practical to wear. You needed something that, if I'm walking around every day, some type of technology where I can tell time, but then also, let's say I'm racing my car on the weekend or something, maybe I want to see how fast I can go in a mile or something. And again, try to stay in that moment, right? There's not a lot of technology available there. So for someone to have something like that or somebody to put out that type of product was very revolutionary. I mean, like, think about when the iPhone first came out. Um, well, think about when the first color screen cell phone came out. Let's just start there. I mean, the iPhone came out. Now I don't have to go to my computer to give you an example, right? When the iPhone came out, you no longer had to go to your computer to read your email. You no longer had to go to your computer to look up something on the internet. Same deal. You have these watches that came out that allows you to tell time, and they're pretty accurate too. I mean, pretty accurate. That's another thing. Yeah, you might have to adjust it every so often, but they're pretty accurate. So while you're doing your outdoor activities, you had utility there. You could either time how fast something was happening, racing, or if you're going scuba diving, you have waterproofing technology. First, let's talk about like waterproofing and some of the icons that appeared around that time. Iconic watch, Omega Seamaster, came out in 1954. Right after the time people really got into scuba diving, boating, more adventurous stuff. Omega Seamaster came out, $700 in today's dollars. As you and I know, you can't even get an Omega for $700 these days, any model, but I'll get into that a little later. Another iconic dive watch, which is the terminology that's used now, dive watch. Rolex Submariner came out 1957, first one, and it was around 1,200 bucks. Pretty reasonable now, right? You're thinking to yourself, well, yeah, 1,200 bucks. That's real okay. That's reasonable for a Rolex. You and I know you're not going to find any Rolex for that price. Well, if you don't know, I'm going to tell you that now. So keep on pace with everything. You have a lack of technology available. You have a Timex watch, a wristwatch that you can get for around 10 bucks. I'm sorry, around $85. Or if you're gonna do, if you're like an outdoorsy type, if you're a scuba diving type, instead of spending 85 bucks for a Timex, maybe you spend 700 or 1,200 bucks for an Omega or a Rolex. Why would you do that? Well, it's the same reason why people spend money on whatever they do. Everything is not just a function, right? Everything is more for form also. So when you buy, again, I'm going to use another example. When you buy products, you don't necessarily just buy the product. Computers, for example. Really, the brains of the computer, if you guys know this, are the processor. And again, I'm just using general terms, so don't get carried away with, I'm not saying exactly right. I'm just trying to give you an analogy here. In the computer, the main thing you're paying for in there, the core part of it is the chip, right? And it's either going to be made by Intel or AMD. Probably one of those two. So, an IBM PC or a Mac, they either going to have an AMD chip or an Intel chip. Prices vary widely, right? Because you're not just paying for that chip, you're paying for a lot of other stuff. Maybe you like the design factors of this one computer better. Maybe you like the aesthetics of it. You know, maybe it's a certain brand. So you have all this stuff going into it. It's not just about the function. So was a Omega Seamaster in 1954 10 times better than a Timex in 1954? Well, I mean, probably not. But part of what you're buying when you buy that Omega or that Rolex is perceived brand quality, just like now. So that's why people would be more prone to make an investment in that type of stuff. Moving off of dive watches, right? Remember I talked about Corvette and Mustang. Those were like some of the first true American sports cars that came out around that time. You had your chronometers. Chronometers had things on it that would let you do more small scale timekeeping on it. Essentially, it was like a stopwatch that was built into your watch. Iconic one that was around that time was the Hauer Carrera. This was before Tag and bought Hauer. It was just called Hauer. The Hauer Carrera came out in 1963, and it was around 700 bucks. So let me tie this back in together. We're talking about hobbies. You had three iconic watches that came out around that time. You either had the Omega Seamaster for around 700, you had the Rolex Submariner for around 1,200, or for your chronometer, iconic chronometer would be your Tag Heuer Carrera, which was around 700 bucks. So very expensive at that time, but still, not completely unrealistic like how it is now. So far, I've covered the technology that was available. I've also covered like some of the hobbies people got into and why there was a need for specific watches. What I want to talk about now is like the need for a good watch. Just like today, you need to know what time it is. Whether you're a business person or a blue collar guy, there wasn't a lot of clocks available, right? There were no iPhones. There wasn't, a clock on the TV, whatever. You needed a good watch. You also needed something that was reliable. Because, keep this in mind, being a watchmaker, that was a skilled trade. So that means that a type of skilled trade, they would only be probably available in major urban areas. If you lived in maybe a rural area in Texas, right? Sure, you could buy that $85 Timex, but if you had problems with it, it was going to be a while before you probably got that fixed because you either probably had to go to the city, find a watch guy who was probably busy. He'd fix it. You go back and pick it up. Like anything in life, it's a hassle. The Swiss watchmakers had developed a reputation for building reliable watches of good quality. It was a marketing campaign just like now. So that was a big draw for people to maybe invest extra money in a reliable watch so that essentially they knew with routine maintenance, right, you wouldn't have a lot of problems with it. Same reason why people pay more money for anything now, right? Yeah, you can go the cheap route or you can go more expensive for less trouble. I mean, we all make decisions like that. Like think about clothing, right? You know, same company. You have the Gap, you have Banana Republic, and you have Old Navy. Your basic tier is Old Navy, right? You need a T-shirt for $3, $5, whatever. I just need something for to wear one day. Probably gonna throw it away. You know, maybe if you have a little bit more money, you might move up to the next tier, which will be the Gap, little mid-tier shirt. Yeah, not gonna be as cheap as the cheapest one. Might last you a little bit longer, but you know pretty much that this is not top tier. Final level would be Banana Republic, using that same clothes analogy. Better quality, better styling. It's gonna last a while. I mean, I've had some Banana Republic khakis that I've had for 7 or 8 years, no problem. Just using that to make a comparison. That in anything in life, there's different price points depending on the type of quality that you want to get. People had a need for a good watch. If you needed something that was reliable, that wasn't going to give you trouble, you could make the rationalization that I'm going to spend a lot of money um, relative to that time for getting a reliable watch. And again, it's not just about the timekeeping. There was also branding that was associated with that. It's also had a good advantage because, and again, I'm not going to really try to bore you too much with history, but during World War II, most of the domestic watchmakers like Hamilton, watchmaking or timekeeping stuff was geared toward the war movement. Like they needed timing devices for bombs and stuff like that. So they weren't really making consumer timepieces. And again, in Europe, you have everything is getting blown up. Switzerland was neutral. So essentially, they essentially developed a monopoly on making watches during that time period. Because in America, all those people were making watches for the war effort. In Europe, I mean, it just wasn't stable. You had bombings going on. And again, I'm probably not saying something exactly right in the history, but I'm just trying to give you a general idea of what was going on. So during the war, the Swiss had developed a almost monopoly on watch production, timekeeping, and after the war ended, of course, I mean they're entrenched. So you need a good watch. Swiss has a good brand, a good reputation for making quality watches. Hence the value proposition of maybe I'm gonna spend $700 or $800 instead of $85 to go for a quality watch. Okay, make sense so far? Okay. Oh, you know what? One last thing, and I'm sorry, but this will make sense to you. So we talked about how maybe you had the post-war generation. They got into watches, right? They needed a watch. So think about this. Those people who maybe the post-war generation, right? They were maybe in their 30s and the 50s or something, right? So they had a watch. Those people started dying out in like the 70s and 80s, right? In general. Now, around that same time, their kids are in their prime earning years in the, 70s, 80s, late 80s, right? Just like today. You want to have some type of symbol that says you made it, you're successful. Your dad, your parent, he was successful. He had a Rolex. Maybe he had an Omega. Not as a status symbol because, again, he actually was doing some activities where he needed something like that. Kids grow up, they say that as, hey, look, my dad had this, like he had a car, he had a house. I need to have that. Again, this is just my whole theory behind this whole thing. That's how maybe the watch came to be more of a token that's passed down. Because now people will say, oh, I'm going to invest in a watch. I'm going to hand it down to my kid. Think about that. Maybe the first time that happened was with that baby boomer generation in the 70s or 80s, which was, 30 something years ago. Big difference is that since then, the game has changed. Meaning as far as pricing. And in the next video, I'll get into why. I'll talk about Swiss, the quartz crisis. I'll go into pricing, so forth and so on. and how, you have these iconic ones still available. But I've covered the basics of like the technology that was available at the time. I talked about how people had more outdoor oriented hobbies, how they had a need for um, timekeeping. I talked about some of the iconic watches and things of that time, the need for a reliable watch. What I want to do now is talking about watch terminology. By this, I mean just some basic vocabulary you need to know before you go looking for any watch. Luxury watches, anyway. Okay? Now, one of the main things you want to look for is water resistancy. Think of that as you would imagine. If I were to go into the water with this swimming, how far down can I go with this thing without it breaking, leaking, pressure testing? If you're going to buy a watch that's water resistant, make sure that it's water resistant up to 100 meters. You can do the math on the conversion of that. But essentially, 100 meters should basically cover you for anything you're probably ever going to do in life. Swimming at the pool during summertime. But I mean, realistically, most people are only going to use it to maybe put it in a sink. So, water resistant, that's essentially what that means. Movement is probably the next and probably the most important of everything. The movement. The movement are the brains of the watch. That is what the computer, think of it as a speak. The movement, the gears and cogs, all that stuff in there that actually makes the hands go around and keep time. Movement, extremely important. Maybe in a future video I'll go into different movements, and that essentially determines the price of something. Most watches, mechanical movement, there's gears and cogs in there. The next thing you need to be aware of is quartz. Instead of having the movement that's powered by gears and cogs, you could have a quartz movement, which means that instead of it being powered by gears and cogs, essentially it's powered by a battery and it's tuned to the oscillations of a quartz crystal. Google that yourself, you'll find that out. Complications are any function on a watch that goes behind timekeeping. It could be an annual calendar, it could be a stopwatch. So a basic watch is considered, and again, I'm just saying in general, 3 hands. Your minute, your minute, your hours, and your seconds. Anything other than that, like the moon dial with the sun, or on a chronometer, any of those little other dials, anything other than that is considered a complication, the terminology to use. More complications, the more expensive it's going to be. Final term you need to be aware of is an automatic watch. Automatic watch means that it's self-winding, meaning that you don't have to wind it every day. You may have seen some of these old movies where people are actually winding their watch every day. Some of them you still have to do that, but essentially an automatic watch means that the gears and cogs in there, they essentially get powered by the movement of you wearing it. Good technology there, right? Handmade. So, terminology is that. Movement, the brains, the gears and cogs that keep the time. You can either have a manual winding movement, one that you twist up, or you can have a self-winding automatic movement. It powers itself. Complications, anything other than the basic hands on the watch. Minutes, hours, seconds, anything other than that. And just know the more complications you have on a watch, the more you're going to pay. Water resistancy, very important, especially when it comes to dive watches. Make sure that it's at least 100 meters. But again, I mean, if you know you're never going to use it for that, it doesn't really matter. And finally, know that quartz is completely different technology than your mechanical movement. Well, I wouldn't say completely different, but essentially the power source is different. Quartz, in general, as a guideline, is going to be a lot cheaper than your mechanical movements. So that being said, I think that sums it up there. The intent of this video was to just give you guys a basic idea of watches. And again, I think this is different because I talked about more of the psychology behind watches, how people got into them, So again, sorry if this video was a tad bit all over the place, but I wanted to kind of give you a psychological idea of why people had a need for these things, how it came to be. I gave you some basic terminology. Don't forget, movement, complications, water resistant, coarse. I gave you some iconic watches to look at, right? Hauer, Carrera, Rolex Submariner, Omega Seamaster, as ideas. Tell me what you think. Leave comments. Let me know if you want to make another one. I'll do another one. Okay? Thanks.